I used to use the word should a lot. I should do this. Should is a dangerous word, I think. But I was like very much in a should mode at a point in my life after WeWork. Should came up for me a lot because I achieved some degree of wealth from WeWork, and a lot of other people didn't. A lot of other people who I cared about lost their job. A lot of other people's dreams were kind of wrapped up in WeWork, and then they were, they fell apart, or they were crushed, or whoever, or however, what happened to them. So I felt like I had to correct a lot of those wrongs for people, or that obligation I carried very heavily. So yeah, things like that, where without process, I don't even know where I would be now, wallowing still in a bad place, probably.
What helped you let go of that feeling of obligation?
It's still the hardest one. For that one, actually, I would say more almost, I wouldn't necessarily call it hypnotic, but more like going into a deeper place and releasing it. So Jessica, who I worked with, is able to bring me into like a meditative state and kind of bring that forward, that feeling of obligation, and then identify where I feel it in my body, for example. And then, through breathing and just practice letting that energy dissipate. So that one's less intellectual. It's a bit more like clearly I'm carrying it, more deeply. And so that one I wasn't able to reason my way out of it. It took a different approach.
Could we go into a little bit more detail as to that process? Because I feel like most of us entrepreneurs are very cerebral and very like reason oriented, and actually so much wisdom can be unlocked from tapping into these non-conscious parts of ourselves.
Well, first I'll say I enter those places with a lot of skepticism, like many of us do, but I think because I grew up in a kind of woo-woo space, a part of my rejection is of these things that are like, less intellectual, less tangible. So, but with Jessica, I really trusted her in a way that I would allow myself to first just enter that, what I would call it, vulnerability, where, she could bring me in to myself in that way, and I would be able to let go and let her do that. So as an example, in WeWork, I had like big aspirations to be inclusive, for example. Like this is a bit before even the words DEI came up, but like earlier on, a huge part of what we believed in was that we want to create this open, supportive environment for people. And, we had incredible stories of people who like first time they came out at work was at their job in WeWork. Or in Brazil, we had an amazing experience where, someone said that it was the first time that he ever felt like he could be himself at work, working in WeWork, and like his release of all of these years of holding himself back from his true self, like was, one of the best moments in my entire time was the way he expressed that. Cause I was like, to me, I'm like, I don't know what that even means. Like, I've never not felt like myself. I've never not felt like I can just, like I felt social anxiety for sure, where I walk into a room, oh, I'm nervous, who I'm going to speak to. But I've never felt like I have to put a new layer over myself. So something like that, to have someone to talk to about like, what does that actually mean? Like code switching, for example, which many non-white men will say. I've heard that a lot. I'm like, what is code switching actually? Like, what does that feel like? Like when someone says that, like, how are they experiencing it? You know what I mean? Like those were things which I had a whole set of things I was trying to serve in terms of inclusion, in terms of creating a place that was amazing for every employee, for having this aspiration for it to be this awesome environment. But at the same time, I was taking on a lot of just responsibility for all of those people to not fail them in that context that I was trying to create. But at the same time, it's like a fire hose. It's like very hard to know how to show up. Like I'll give another example. Sorry, I'm saying so many things at the same time. Another example for me was we had a group in WeWork called We of Color, which was obviously a non-white collection of WeWork employees. And there was a gathering of We of Color in this hotel, which was around our summit event, which was like an all-employee gathering. And so they asked me to come, and I was like, yeah, of course I'll come to the event. And so I come in, and I'm the only white person there, and okay, that's fine. I was enjoying myself. It was great. They say like, will you say a few words? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'll say a few words. It's all good. And then a woman comes up to me and she's very nervous, like kind of shaking nervous, and someone's bringing her up, like kind of encouraging her to like approach me, and first of all, like the way I see myself is as very approachable. Like, I don't know, I'm wrong maybe, but to me, I'm like a regular guy. Like I'm very approachable, right? So to have this person who looks terrified to speak to me is like quite weird. And I'm trying to process it in the moment. Like, I don't understand exactly what's going on, but like she comes up and, I forget her exact words, but it was basically gratitude that she was sharing, thank you. I love working here. This is the best job I've ever had. So wonderful to meet you. It was all gratitude, very sweet. And I remember I've, felt, so much like love in that moment. And also success, like, whoa, I played a part in creating this thing where this person is having that experience. Right. But then afterwards, someone said to me, they were like, oh, she said that she was one of our older team members at where we work. She's been working in New York for like 30 years or something. She's never met her boss before. I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, she's worked for lots of companies, but she's never been in the same room with her boss. And I'm like, I was just like processing like that. To her, I represent this corporate structure where there's the person who cleans up the office and the CEO, and they're so far apart that they'll never even stand in the same room. And I was like, holy fuck, like that's just so like, I've never thought of that before. Like, of course I know now that you told me that that's what happens, because whatever, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan is not speaking in the same room to like the janitor, for example. But I never understood what does that actually mean on a human level, like that, what it would feel like to be that disempowered, to be that far away, to feel so like that kind of experience, which I had in many cases. I was like, God, these things are really fucked up things that we build. Like they're weird, like they're very strange. They're so not human. Like they don't make sense. Like there's so many things that would be so easy. Like it's totally worth the CEO's time to go connect with people. Like, why is it like this? Like, and so my aspiration in that context was like exploding, like exploding aspiration of how we're going to be a different company than anyone else. Like, like the opportunity to be amazing and do things differently is so huge because so many people are doing it so poorly. And so for that to collapse and be like, that's gone because it's gone. Like a lot of people, oh, you can build it back again. No, I can't. Like it's so hard. It takes so much of the right conditions to build a company where that condition even happens, where you get that much distance between those team members, right? And where you get to employ that many people, you know, it's so hard to build a company that employs 10,000 people. I mean, that's hard. So I can't, I mean, yes, maybe I'll do it again someday, but like, it's so hard to get it back. And I think that's where this like should was so deep. Like I must make up for this failure. Like I failed that woman. Because where is she going? Back to one of those other companies where people could care less about her. And that really fucking, like that's really hard to accept. And that's like wherever it was, deep in here. And that's the process that doesn't just come from like intellectual reasoning to escape from it, right? It took go in here, find it, feel it fully, accept it, try to let it go. My heart is like beating so fast right now because it's clearly not let go completely. But it's a process.
What does letting it go actually look like?
I think the difference between holding it, having it, letting it go, it's really in the thought loops for me that come up. You know, it's in because there's reminders of these things all the time, whether it could be a person who I might see in the world in real life or in some context, an idea, you know, like that thing that I mentioned earlier about that HR company, you know, that was an example like that came up and I was like, fuck, like we were doing that, you know, and I can now have a light response to that. Like, yeah, we tried, you know, it was cool. Like that was really cool what we were trying to do. And I'm really happy that someone else is building that. Like, that's great. But I carry that, you know, lightly. Whereas I would say if I hadn't let that go, it would really be like, I would be frustrated. I might carry it for, you know, hours or days, you know, just being like coming back, you know, like frustrated, et cetera. So, the things still come up, but it's just more, okay, it comes up. I see it. It's fine. Like, you know, I accept it. It's there, but it's not sticking with me. I'm not like obsessing over it. And that allows me to feel more freedom rather than existing in this world of constantly looking back or, you know, staying in a place of regret, or taking actions that are related to that, you know, which could be literally like, I should take this action to make up for the fact. Now, it sounds a bit cold, I think, but it's a bit like I can hear the thing about the person and I can say, well, it's not my responsibility. Like, I did what I've done what I've done. I've done what I could. I can't be responsible for everyone. And no one can, I think that's also a realization for me, is that ambition can be quite, big, but every ambition has a perimeter, and that's part of why I find it kind of funny when we used to say all the time, like, entrepreneurs, I think, I want to change the world, and I really, that kind of annoys me in a sense that people say that, because, like, what does changing the world really mean? I mean, and who has changed the world? Like, I'm sure that there are arguments for how Uber changed the world, for example, but, like, has it? I don't know. You could still take a taxi before. Now you can take a Uber. I don't know. It's not, the world hasn't changed that much. So I think it's more the definition of what that means that kind of gets under my skin a little bit. But whatever. I'm not carrying too heavily.
What does it mean to you?
I think that we can each, play our own role in our existence. And if we do it with agency and we're proactive, that we can impact other people, and we can impact their experience for sure, in perhaps terms that go longer than our lifespan, but the world seems to operate just fine without any one of us. And even if Walmart, one of the biggest companies in the world, collapsed tomorrow, everything would be fine. Like, people would just keep living, right? Or if JP Morgan, collapsed tomorrow, like, do you think we wouldn't still be living the next day? Like, I don't know. Like, who cares really? Even if all the internet systems went down and we didn't have an iPhone in our hand, like, would we be all right? Yeah. So I guess that's part of where I guess it's just, maybe it's a definition of what it means and why it matters. And I think I see that as more ephemeral than I used to. I used to think that these things were more permanent. And I think as I've seen more cycles, I feel like everything changes much faster than we expect, actually.
Especially if you look on a much longer time horizon.
Yeah, but even that time horizon is getting shorter now, right? For massive change, I think, in terms of the way we see things. Like, I mean, even the way the US president can shorten what it means to take action from presidential political. Like, he's showing that ways we perceive things were completely different. Or AI, and the way it's affecting our current existence, is moving much quicker than the way we thought was, possible to sort of change fundamental interactions, with information and technology. So I think those cycles are getting much faster, or I think those smarter people than me are saying that. But again, what I go back to is, I can, for the most part, exist without consciousness of those things, and I'm okay. And so when I think about changing the world, it's usually has to do with human consciousness that would actually be a change. And so far, no one's been able to do that. No startup founder's been able to do that.
What does human consciousness mean to you?
A kind of collective awareness of our shared existence and our interdependency and our need for each other. And in a, not in a intellectual sense, but in a literal, like biological sense, that we're, that we're all part of a system. And I don't mean that in any kind of spiritual way. To me, I just sort of see that as like, it's a natural system, and it's impossible to deny the fact that we're sort of recycled, beings. We're playing a part in some kind of infinite, in our understanding of time, experiment of regeneration. So without a different application of meaning to that we all take hold of together, it's hard to see changing the world. Now, I don't mean that you can't, obviously, from a small community to a cult to a religion to a blank, can definitely impact a lot of people. I just want to be really clear. When I say change the world, I'm just saying that, like, the Mongolians could give a fuck about Uber. You know what I mean? That's what I mean more. Well, I'm sure I don't know if there's Uber in Mongolia, but my point being is that, like, there are people existing on different planes. And when I say changing the world, I don't just mean that you got 100 million customers, right? Like, that's not changing the world. That's just building a, large business.
Quick pause to say, if this show has brought you some clarity, then hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because one insight at the right time can change everything. Plus, it fuels the show so I can keep on showing up for you. Right, let's get back to the episode.
I feel like there's this constant tension between business approach and a community approach. Even the past sort of like couple of decades of entrepreneurs and company builders have been honed into much shorter time frames, and therefore have a much shorter term mindset than people who are looking to build long-lasting community, which naturally you have to take a very long view of. Where did you see these tensions between business mindset and community-focused mindset surface?
When we first started, we talked about our business as a lifelong business. And even beyond that, like, we saw it as something that our children would be a part of, for example, So I used to say, I want to work at WeWork for 100 years. And sorry, I should say the reason for that was a lot to do with the premise of the business, not the actual business model, for example, right? We, as a premise, we believed was fundamental to existence, and in business it was ultra unique, right? Like, we were approaching business in a completely different way from other people, and we thought it was so valid that it would, like, last forever, that it was sort of fundamentally human, that connection and community was so important that, in a way, the rest of the business is kind of irrelevant. Not in the sense that it doesn't matter what we do, but that we could do a whole wide array of things when we apply this approach, So that's why when we started, we were thinking about all these different business areas, from work to live to, eat to sleep, like, hotel. I mean, we thought we could go into any business domain. I mean, within some degree of reason. But because of that, it wasn't like there was no natural end to that extension. There was no finish line. And so I think having that from the very beginning allowed us to have the space to say community really matters, connection really matters, much more than if we were sort of outcome oriented, related to a certain, scale accomplishment or something like that. So we had time, And it's funny because this actually goes back to the very beginning of WeWork. We came up with the name. We knew we were looking for something that has to do with now we can say but community being fundamental to the business, right? Connection and community. We had done Green Desk before. We knew what it was like to do a shared office space, a co-working space. But now we're saying, but if you make the fundamental part of it being this human experience that we share day to day as the most important part, what do you call that? We're coming up with all these words, whatever, blah, blah, we can't come up. Then we finally come up with we and WeWork and We Live, et cetera. But now I'm designing like the first website, and my designs have no we in it whatsoever. The first WeWork website was a picture of this group of people holding a slab of marble in the back of a truck. And there's a little bit of like it took the strength to hold the marble. It was a big slab, but it didn't have community. And so Adam looked at it and he's like, what is this? Like, why don't we have community? And I was like, well, because we don't have any community yet. And he's like, yeah, but it's WeWork. Like we should have like, something. And I was like, yeah, but all the community websites are so cheesy. Like there are people holding hands or, people standing in a circle or whatever. You can't like sell we before you have it. You can't sell community. You just have to be it. And so once we are it, then everyone will know that we're it. We're not going to need a website that like, shows this image to prove it. And so you have to have just right in there, you've got to have the time to actually be the community, right? You can't say you're a community without being one, right? It just has to happen. And a lot of people argued about that. Like, can you build community or do you just support it? Or are you a community or, can you define one? Like all these questions. So we had all these debates and I was always like, just wait, just like step back from these debates and just, let it happen. And in many ways it did, there's obviously arguments against people who would argue about the strength of the WeWork community, but both at an employee level and at a member level, I think you always felt something different when you encountered and engaged with WeWork. And to me, that was because we had community and connection underlying everything that we were trying to do.
In these discussions of how you try to define community, I'm guessing the definition for you personally has evolved over time. That's my assumption. You grew up in a very community-focused household. WeWork had community baked into its DNA, and now you're incorporating that into this startup as well. What's been your evolution in terms of your understanding of community?
That's a great question. From my perception, there's an idealism often that is a uniting factor. So when I was a child, the women that I was around, that I was raised by, were rejecting feminine roles and, didn't want to live in the Midwest in whatever, a house with a white picket fence and raise kids and be in the kitchen like their moms had. And so they were a part of a more, I would call it, I guess even global, but a larger movement, towards feminist ideology. But anyway, they had idealism that united them. They were like, we know we're not the same as everyone else. And so therefore we can align in this way. And so identity is a really interesting one because identity always means exclusion, right? Like usually you're saying we're this and they're not. So we can now gather and build community through this exclusion. In WeWork, we had a real challenge of that because part of what we experienced was a lot of exclusion at the time, right? There was at the time, and people kind of who maybe forget this, but co-working was a lot about excluding. It was all tech bros who were like, top engineers and were like, we all want to work together and like get all these other non-tech people out of our way. You know, that was a lot of the vibe in the early days. There was a lot of accelerators that would put people together and say, if you've raised X amount, you know, you can be a part of this accelerator. There was a lot of, you know, clubs that went to the like full bottle service route where like you can't even get in the door, but if you can, you've got to buy this expensive table, you know, it's all velvet rope. Like, you know, that was the vibe in the early 2000s. You know, it was a lot of exclusion. And so part of WeWork was like anyone can be a part of it. And that has positive and negative. Like one, it is inclusive, but there was never a manifesto, right? There was never a, you must align to these values or else you're not allowed to be here, right? And so that made the perimeter weak. And the perimeter is often what defines a community more palpably, is like, we know we're in and we know those others are out, right? So in a way, that was it was a learning in what does a more loosely defined community look like, you know, one where we feel something, but we haven't yet put, you know, hard edges on it. And I think that's one I like a lot more, because especially in today's world, we're so polarized and divided that like those hard edges just suck, you know, they're terrible, I think. So I like the WeWork definition of community much more, which is a bit looser and a little less clear, but is a more of a vibe than like a, you know, a perimeter. So yeah, going forward, I haven't thought that clearly about how I would apply that in today's world. I think identity still matters. I think aspiration matters. Like, what are you here for? What are you going for? I think self-awareness is a big part of that. If you don't know who you are, how can you join a community, right? Like, there's a whole bunch out there, but if you're totally unaware of yourself, which one would you even know to kind of orient towards? So
my gut is to push back on this, because I don't know if you've read Priya Parker's Art of Gathering. One of her core fundamental sort of like, not rules of community, but sort of guidelines for building very inclusive gatherings is that you have to exclude to include. You can't, it doesn't feel inclusive if everyone's invited, because you don't feel connected to everyone. We feel connected to people that we identify with on some way, shape or form, whether that be a title or a gender or a vibe. And so I feel like connecting people based on a feeling is easier when it's much smaller. Whereas when it gets bigger, it becomes like this, I don't know, if I feel like it has a stronger need to be clear on the boundaries or on the identity of the community. And so then I'd like, maybe the follow-on question for this is, how do you feel like the WeWork community felt at the early days when it was smaller versus now?
I don't know if size in WeWork's context makes a difference, but I do think Brene Brown says some really interesting things about this, which I've never thought about them necessarily being in opposition to Priya Parker, but I do think it's something to think about, which is, you know, Priya Parker often contextualizes her ideas around gathering. And I've always thought of them as like gatherings in a room where people can fit. Brene Brown has talked about people at a stadium watching a sporting event, right? And the community that comes from that shared experience. In that context, people do have an aligning identity. Maybe they're all fans of a sports team, but all the rest of their views, their backgrounds, their values could be completely different. And yet there's something really powerful about sharing this experience together, you know, watching the sports team. But Brene Brown would say, if you needed someone to pick up your child from school, who would you trust more? You know, the person who you're in a community with outside of your neighborhood that has, ideological alignment, or would you trust the person you've seen every day as your neighbor, right? And whether that person is, say, much different than you on a whole bunch of other, points of personality or values, et cetera. So I think WeWork fell more into those two definitions of community, where we experienced large collective events where perhaps we're all fans of or we're in a neighborhood where we're sitting next to a person and we have familiarity because we see them every day and the walls are glass. So we're getting this like vibe and connection through this shared experience, but we're not actually ideologically aligned in the way that I think you might define it in that kind of inclusive, exclusive way. So I think it's totally fair to say in some definition of community that your Priya Parker example is correct, but I think there's a whole other definition of community which doesn't put that same, divisive line between people. And probably both are valuable, right? Like it's probably, as a person, if you can be a part of some of each of those, that's probably the ideal situation, because both of them would be asking something differently of you, right? If you're with a bunch of people who you're clearly aligned with and you feel super ultra connected to because you know that you're completely psychologically safe and maybe you can be totally open and all this kind of stuff, like that could be a very great community. But then to be also in another community where you need to be mindful, willing to listen to someone who has ideas differently than yours, to feel offended once in a while, but realize it's okay and you're going to survive, like very valuable as well, So we probably need both and multiple of both. I think container is a word I love to use much more than community, because a container, I imagine, is something I worked with a coach on trying to understand, is that a container is a bit more like a riverbed, in the sense that it's constantly changing and moving, and you can never, in that Japanese sense, you can never like step in the same river twice, because the water's continually moving and the bank is constantly changing and the bottom of the river obviously is, moving along with it. And so these containers are always in development and, collapse and reformation. And because of that, and the participants within them are always changing as well. So we can never, there's no formation that we can ever put our finger on and say, this is the one.
I remember you said at this retreat where we met that after the whole WeWork saga, you wrote down all of your lessons into a booklet of how to do business, or like how to build a great company, and you gave it to people, and it just didn't work because it's all situational, it's always evolving. Those lessons made sense in that period of time in that container, whereas it's since evolved and changed.
That's one way to say it. Yes. As you're saying that, it makes me feel a bit sad, because it's like all this wisdom is wasted. But that's a whole other topic, which I think is quite interesting, is how do we receive wisdom? And I actually had this experience yesterday listening to, I actually can't remember his name because the podcast just autoplayed, but it was the founder of AngelList.
Naval Ravikant.
Yeah.
Love him.
So I've never heard of him before until yesterday, but he's obviously quite outspoken in all of these different, on Twitter and whatever, I don't know, just what I heard on the podcast. But he spouted like so much wisdom in like such a short amount of time that I was a bit like, I don't know what the words are. I'm not going to qualify it because I'm still processing it. But I was kind of like, if I wanted to actually make this useful, I would need to slow it down, either type it out or somehow record it all, then go through it, study it, try to figure out which of the things applied to me, which were actually interesting. Try to find like the way that I actually ingest them so that they become part of my understanding of being. I would also, obviously, in some cases, I resisted against some of them. So I'd have to do some kind of process of like, well, he's wrong. Or wait, is he wrong? I don't know. I should, it wouldn't be easy, right? It's not like I could just take that all at once and just like use it, even though it was wisdom that he's obviously developed over a long period of time. And he's a very thoughtful guy. So I kind of put what I was talking about in the same category. Like I came up with this whole idea of an operating system for business that like I could hand to you for your startup, like, here you go. But you can't like digest it that way. There's no way for you to take it all on. Like the same thing with, I'm sorry, I forgot his name again.
Naval.
Naval. I can't just take all that on at once, right? So that's one of the things, and especially for entrepreneurs who are busy doing tons of stuff, they want the information that they need at the time that they need it, right? They don't want a book that explains everything that then they're like, oh, well, this thing came up. Now let me go look through this book to find the answer. It's kind of like, it's a whole different way of, and I think that's the same in life in a lot of ways, is like, you need the realization, or you need that particular piece of wisdom that applies to you in the moment, like when you need it. If you heard it when you don't need it, it just slips right through you. If you get it at the right time, it could resonate with you for the rest of your life, So how do you do that? How do you find it at the right time? It's quite an interesting thing to like theorize the method of absorption that's correct.
On this topic, first of all, I'll lend you my copy of his book because that's the condensed version of some of his teachings.
Can I just mention one thing related to what he said in the podcast?
Yeah.
Which applied to me today. He said that he like never makes plans. He refuses to ever commit to anything. And every day he just does whatever he wants to do based on how he feels in the moment. And so he said, for his wife, she's not allowed to schedule, say, dinner for him with another couple or with a group. Basically, that has no schedule, no calendar, no commitments, nothing. And that was one which resonated with me, but also sounded offensive to my kind of empathy and imagining like how that even is for his wife. Just, it sounded brutal to me in the moment. And it made me not like the guy at all. Like, so it's just interesting about how you receive stuff, is that I'm a bit like, you offered me his book. I'm like, I wouldn't read that fucking guy's book because he's an asshole. Like that's my current understanding of him based on that particular thing that he said. Now he said a whole bunch of other stuff, which I may or may not like or appreciate or need or who knows what. But that particular thing that he said, while it gave me some freedom this morning to be late because I was like, hey, I'm doing what feels right to me, I also, it really colored my perception of him overall in a way that I'm a bit turned off to. And that also goes to a little bit of like, he feels a bit too conclusive, like as if he knows these things. And that kind of annoys me too. Like no one knows anything. They may know it for themselves for a period of time, but like no one knows anything. So like it feels a bit annoying to me that he's like, this is how it is.
Quick 10-second pause to say that our newsletter is the highest value per sentence in your inbox. We share systems, prompts, and scripts that you can use today, because content without action is just noise. All the links in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode.
There's a lot of similarities between startups and religions. And there's a book about WeWork called The Cult of We. And people talk about cults and like you should build a cult if you're a startup founder. And there are lots of these ideas around how at their core, at their fundamental, you're bringing people together around a shared purpose, a shared identity. People are willing to dedicate time and energy and focus towards a specific goal. Religion, as you said, is like sort of this ideology that defined an exact way of being, and what we've seen now is a sort of a gradual trend away from that. And that's where I feel like maybe part of what made WeWork click really hard at the start was that people didn't have this sense of meaning and identity and like a place to find other people in this sort of new age of trying to figure out what it's all about.
Yeah. Cult is a word that has been given a lot of meaning in different contexts that seems negative. So I think when they say WeWork was a cult, it probably means something like bad, right? It's a criticism or something. If I strip that away and only go on my own understanding of the experience and then call it a cult, right? So don't take the way cult is defined, whatever, on historical terms or current terms or whatever it is. But I just use that word to describe what it was like inside WeWork. I really love the construct, the container that contains in it purpose, meaning, identity, direction, passion, love. All those things are amazing. And love being at the root of, I think, much of what we were doing is a great container to be in. So I believe in that from the standpoint of human experience, meaning if more people had that or got to experience that, I think it would be a positive. So if a startup is like that, it contains love and connection and meaning and identity, I think that's amazing. And I would love that definition of cult in that context. Now, where our history and the whole thing with cults gets weird is that there's often a leader of a cult, and the leader is often powerful, and power corrupts and all that. So that's where it gets tough. And in our case, I do think that while I don't believe that Adam was corrupt, and I don't think I was corrupt, I do think that power became problematic in the WeWork context, primarily because it derailed us from what we were really up to. You know, it derailed us from our business needs or requirements in order to be a sustainable, profitable business. And that would take more to go into, but I do think that they interrelate, right? Like if you feel powerful and you no longer feel constrained by sustainable business practices, then it gets weird. And I do think that's what happens when you just get billions of dollars and are told to just go take over the world, right? Like it's very hard for a young person in that context to not go that way. So if I go to like, again, the human experience, participating in a cult-like environment, I think it's great. Is it possible to create a startup in our current capitalistic system that doesn't result in some really weird shit that goes on? I don't see the many examples of that. And I think, and I also think that leaders in general, too often young men who don't have much life experience, who become the people at the top of these cults, are not prepared to, take them in good places. So there's a lot of, young kings in the world who aren't good cult leaders. And that's a bummer. So that's why I can't say it's a good thing for startups, because again, startups are often young people, oftentimes men, oftentimes unprepared socially, emotionally, psychologically to actually participate in these things. It's not great.
I feel like it depends on how it's used. So you have this sort of magnet, which is this shared purpose, shared mission, shared identity, and a direction, and that draws people in. And then with that, you have this sort of inherent power where you can then guide those people because you've drawn them in with this magnet. The challenge I have is that, like, Adam did feel like he was a lot more focused on maintaining this power. Like, he tried to get more voting rights for his shares. He had 10 votes per share and then tried to double it again when talked to the SoftBank. And so it felt like he got attached to this sort of power of being able to take WeWork in whatever direction. There was sort of manipulation and pressure to work a lot longer and a lot harder because it was all in pursuit of this shared vision of a connected world, which again, like, as you say, I think we all agree with. Like, a more connected, community-driven world is an amazing world. And I suppose it feels like it has this sour turn to it when that's being used as like almost like a bargaining chip. I wonder, what did that feel like for you?
It's a really interesting perception. And I think perception is at root of this, because for me, I was a person who loved working as many hours of the day as possible. So while I don't think anyone would ever say I cracked a whip, I, as an example, was at the office all hours of the day, all the time, right? So I know that impacted people who felt like I was an example for how you needed to show up at WeWork. Was a person who was completely dedicated, put work above everything, because I loved that and I was enjoying every minute of it, right? There was no stress involved in that equation for me. While I did realize at some point that was not for everyone, I was intellectually honest with myself and with other people I spoke to, saying, this company is not for everyone. Like, if you're a person who doesn't enjoy this, then don't work here. Like, if you're a person who wants to have, at the time, work-life balance was what we called it, I would say this isn't the place for you. Like, that's not what we have here. But we're doing work that is quite enjoyable for the people who for many of the people who do it. And so at this time in our lives, it's like, it's a great way to be, And I will say that my background is in architecture before WeWork and design. And in architecture, there's a long history of people working incredibly long hours for very low pay, right? In some cases at the intern stages for no pay, working for the great architects of our histories. And the reason you're doing that is like for this greater good, that like you're participating in bringing great architecture to the world. So that's the model that I came from. Now, and to me, was sort of like a noble pursuit or whatever. Not in those words, but in an abstract sense, like putting your life to build something great was a model I was totally comfortable with. Adam came from like Israeli military background. So he definitely had a more like crack the whip, fear is motivating, like, anger will inspire people. In the early days, he had that. But I believe for the most part, I taught him that at least for young Americans, that was not an approach that was going to work. And so he didn't wield that very often. His crack the whip, I would say, was more... I don't think it was like you need to work longer hours. I mean, I could be wrong. Adam was to me a lot more of just like like I live life to its fullest all the time, and I believe that everyone else should. And that combination of the two of us being like, I love working so much, and Adam is like a all on full go all the time, like a raw, like that kind of energy. I think that combo was quite intense. So for some people who liked that, it was awesome. And it was unlike anything else that most of them ever experienced before or after. For other people, it was terrible. It was completely the opposite of what they wanted. And so in the later years, when we were hiring, by the thousand, and people were coming from other companies that, maybe they worked at Google or who knows what, like there's people who just weren't the right fit in that sense. And so we had to develop a more regularized kind of approach to work. And so if those tendencies that we had came out, they could feel abrasive or whatever to people who are coming from a different kind of approach. But I don't mean this in a bad way, but I don't have much sympathy for people who are in the wrong environment and then are victims. Like, leave the environment. I mean, in a work environment, like obviously there's lots of other cases where you can't leave, but I kind of find it like bullshit to be like, oh, I took this job and now I'm, somehow I was unaware of what it was like, even though there was tons of ways to learn what it was like in advance. And now I'm a victim somehow. I don't know. You can be a victim to a lot of stuff that happens in a company, but I don't think you're a victim to the culture of the company in that way. Again, there are places where the culture of a company has supported very bad behavior for sure. And that we had some of that as well in some small cases where there was bad actors in our environment. So I'm not excusing that at all. I'm more talking about this intensity and this like typical startup mentality of like, go, 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 we're building something great, like be a part of it. It's a rocket ship, get on, join us. Like if you're a victim to that, like go work somewhere else.
And I suppose this becomes a lot more difficult as you scale the culture. Like when it's you and Adam in the room and you're there around everyone, the culture is very clear. People are looking at you going, oh, that's what this is all about. Whereas when you get past hundreds of people, it becomes so much more difficult. So what have been your lessons in scaling a culture?
Well, first of all, I think believing that you can scale and make it better, it was fundamental to our growth and our whole experience. So I had a realization. So I led like design and product for the first, I can't even remember, 5 years or something. And then we were growing so fast that I was like, to me, the area where we really are going to need innovation and a unique approach is in culture or HR. And so I had this inflection point where I kind of quit my job as the head of product and design and went completely into like reading every single book I could on HR and culture. And almost all of them had a theme of when you scale, it gets worse. And we reflect back to the old days when it was better. So I developed this idea of, in that context of, we have to imagine it gets better as we grow. Because if we're not even in that mindset, then what the hell are we doing? So that was fundamental to my way of seeing it. And then that allowed me to look at every single system that affected people and say, if that's better resourced, if we have more ways to innovate because we just have more time and space, like let's look at how it gets better instead of worse over time. And a lot of those things were highly aspirational, and many of them are being realized now in like startup companies that are doing ideas that we had. But
Could you give an example?
well, one example would be, say, like in benefits. So it sounds stupid, but we had at a time, whatever your off the shelf kind of benefits program was. And we had this debate about 401k because we had limited resources, and some people really wanted 401k, or I'd actually say some people's parents wanted this 401k retirement plan. It was one of the things we found the most was that it was like a validation for a young person of a job is, does it have a 401k program? So we didn't have it. We get asked all the time. Then we had some other things that other people wanted, which were not a 401k. But the problem was you couldn't like just get a 401k for part of your employees. Like the way 401k was set up is it's got to be this like whole. And so I'm there thinking, well, this is really stupid. Like, why is it set up where half the employees want a 401k, half the could give a fuck about it and would much rather have a different benefit? So why does it have to be uniform for everyone? So we developed a whole thing that was like a Chinese menu of benefits, right? So some people want really high level, and again, we're in the US context, so really high level healthcare. Other people would take the lowest level healthcare, but want, you know, a sort of health spending plan, like they want to pay for their gym or, you know, other health related things. Some people want a 401k. Some people would rather have that money now in the form of, say, an allowance for their new child or for daycare or something, right? So it was all these different things that you could put on a Chinese menu and then say, employees choose, right? At the time, that didn't exist at all in any way. I just read about a startup yesterday, which I can't remember the name. It's called like Thatch, I think, that basically does that for companies, does this, and they're growing quick. They raised a bunch of money. So it's things like that where you're looking at these things and you're saying, here's what we've got and here's what would be better. And we've felt when you're totally empowered as a company with tons of venture capital and you're growing super fast, you get the freedom to like say, let's do it differently. But another example would be, you know, when it comes to work life, we had community managers who were for the most part young women. Community manager was a great job. Basically have an entrepreneurial young woman, not all women, but a lot of them are women who are super social, love interacting with people on a day-to-day basis, are great people managers, are really good at, you know, just day-to-day operations. And they're doing a job which doesn't exist anywhere else. As a WeWork community manager, there's no parallel. There's not, like the closest you can kind of find would be someone who runs like a camp or something, a summer camp for kids maybe, but then it's kids, not adults, right? You know, hotel manager, not the same. Restaurant manager, not the same. Retail manager, not the same. You know, there's no parallel. Amazing job. But then these young women started evolving, getting older, and many of them want to have children. So just in that, we did a whole study on how can we redefine what full-time work looks like for this workforce, which we have, which is in the thousands of, again, primarily women in their 20s or early 30s, and allow them to still work at WeWork, but basically be a half-time employee. You know what I mean? So that was like another great example of like, this just didn't really exist. Like you had part-time where it's not really a career, you know, you get paid low, whatever. It's kind of like you're departing from a career trajectory. No, let's keep them in a management position. Let's keep them on a career trajectory where they're building their experience, but let's allow it to be sort of fractional, you know? So they're not falling out of the workforce, but they're still getting to raise children, right? Super amazing work that we did and so fulfilling to try to develop that. Again, unfortunately, a thing that kind of went away when WeWork collapsed. But for me, that stuff was like so fun to work on because there was at the time, there was no comparison. There was no one else doing it. There was no one else who was addressing that issue with the same level of resources and sophistication that we were able to approach it with.
That's amazing. And I love all of those initiatives. And it feels like that's such a hallmark for companies when they reach a certain size and they're able to invest that much in HR and these people systems. But what happens when you go back to the start like you have done now? How has your idea of building a culture when it's 1, 5, 10, 15, 20 people, how has that changed or evolved through this experience?
In the things that I worked on immediately after WeWork, I had a very strong, I would call it kind of heavy-handed approach to that because I was like, I think I know the answers. And so I'm going to try to like apply all this stuff I've learned. So for example, I invested in a company called American Giant, which is a clothing company based in the US. And they're small at the time, or they still are small, but I don't know, maybe they're 20, 30, 40 employees, something like that. And when I made the investment, part of my idea was like, I'm basically going to become the like, you know, culture builder of this company. And so first thing we did was like this, they were having an offsite that was their annual offsite. And I looked at the program and I was just like, oh my God, this is like terrible. What are you doing? Like, you're doing everything wrong. You know, let me get my hands on that, you know, redesign the whole thing. And at the time I had this kind of venture studio group that I was employing of, you know, 5 or 7 people, whatever. And so we like redid the whole offsite, you know, and we did a series of WeWorky style things leading up to the offsite. And then, you know, we conducted this whole offsite in a way that I think was super cool. But then the offsite ended and we went back to American Giant day to day. And there's no resources to continue any of those programmatic kind of efforts. And I had this really weird thing where I was like, well, I'm looking at the P&L, like we can't afford to hire more people at American Giant. I mean, we'll just lose more money. So that doesn't make sense. And no one has time, like everyone's resource constricted already. Like we're already not doing enough of the things that we need to do to just make the business work on a day-to-day basis. So how do we implement all of these ideas I might have? And we just couldn't, you know, there was really no way to, like, we could shift some aspects of the culture in hopefully positive ways when it comes to, say, the way meetings are conducted and things like that. But it was really hard. And so that was a bit of a reminder that at WeWork, again, because we were so resource empowered, our approaches could be quite different. So now I'm a lot lighter in that sense. I still have the idealism, but I can't have a full-time job as a culture builder for a 5-person company. You know what I mean? There's a bunch of other stuff that needs to be done. So I don't know. I don't know the answer yet.
So then obviously you have to you boil it down to what's realistic within the resources that you have and the time that you have. And so that then just comes down to, okay, what's the most important thing that we do? Like, obviously how meetings are run feels pretty important because that compounds over time. You have meetings every day or like loads every week. Is there sort of 80-20 of this that you came to?
It's a great question. I don't think I have a good 80-20 or a good definition, but I'm glad for the provocation because I think I should develop it. For me, it shows up a bit more. I'll give an example, which something I definitely would not have done starting WeWork or a previous company. With my 2 co-founders, we had a long discussion about shadow and about how we show up when we're at our worst, for example, and what we can do for each other when that shows up, and how we can be aware of it, how we can help each other. And that was a kind of foreign idea to both of them at the time. I think it was a really great, we've actually done it a couple of times, but that one is a really, for me, an important thing because, you know, it's easy when you're busy to ignore your emotional state, even your own. And then also when you're really busy to completely ignore the person who's sitting right next to you in their emotional state and just kind of bury yourself in the work. So having some awareness of like, you're being really quiet or you're being really short or you're being, you know, what's up with you? And should we actually talk about it, you know, rather than just being like, oh, he's being weird today. I'll just, you know, go away from that. Instead, say, let's come together and like, hopefully bond over whatever we might be experiencing and going through, which would be probably a hard conversation. I think that practice, doing it early, leads to much better when things actually get tough. And that's something I think was a huge mistake with Adam and I, is that in the early days, we were super bonded. We carried that bond for many years. And then at some point, we kind of started going like this, where we drift apart and things would definitely be between us that we didn't really want to address. And then once in a while, we would come back together and like get into that stuff, but it was not enough. And I think that it's a bummer to look back at that and see the results that it has and know that like, I'm smarter than that. Like he's smarter than that. Like we could have done better in that way. And we had the tools. We're both capable of showing up in that way, but we kind of, for whatever reason, we didn't. And, I think that's, it's a reminder, even me saying it out loud, that like my aspiration is for my co-founders and I now to keep that closeness. It's inevitable that we, go apart as different things happen, but like the more we keep pulling it back together, the better.
I feel like it's the same in any close relationship, same with the marriage, right? It's like you have to keep on recalibrating to make sure that you're both aware and not making assumptions and just come back to the same place.
Well, and not only that, but also when there's something there, it's that has grown between you, it can be for many people, it's like it's a dangerous place. So I've been conflict avoidant for my whole life. So even though I actually really enjoy conflict in the moment when we're having it, the thought of it is quite disruptive for me. So I just want to go away from it as much as possible. So that's part of what happened, is like, okay, the conflict showed up and I don't want to deal with it. So that just starts this drift. And I think going into that earlier keeps that, so, and obviously, in personal relationships, that's been a massive change for me, is that my wife now is not conflict avoid and wants to address the conflict as soon as possible, so that while it's still small, which is amazing, it's an amazing ability to be like, oh, there's a little tiny grit of sand conflict. Like, let's go into it right now. Like, let's not let it be there any longer, because in my experience of life, very few people have that ability to do that. It's like I've experienced way more people where it's like, oh, it started as a grain of sand and now it's become a dragon,
Can you give an example of where distance grew between you and Adam?
Wow. I would say as a general approach, we were always different, and thus our ways of being needed to be closely integrated in order to be functional. So as an example, I might have a strong empathetic response to something, sometimes going too far. Like, let's say an employee did something that should be an offense that they should be fired for. My empathetic response, oh, we can't fire that person, it'll ruin their life, blah, blah, blah. Adam, in my view, his empathetic response wouldn't show up in that context. He'd be like, fire them immediately. Like they did something bad, So usually a great combo would be some mix of empathetically firing the person, like still firing them, for example, because they did something bad, but like doing it in a way that wasn't just like harsh and hardcore and, causing the person pain, but more like looking out for them and hopefully helping them through that experience in some way. So I think that combo was a great one. And you could apply that same kind of combo to a lot of things that happen. But if you look later on and you become just, say, you abstract that same idea to some extent, you could have me with now let's talk about, say, performance reviews, right? If you take Adam's perspective, he could learn from someone that, like, I don't know, some company in the world they do performance reviews, they grade everyone 1 out of 10 and they fire the lowest 10%, like just as a practice. And then I could be like, whoa, like that's so out of date. Like that's not the way modern, like modern HR and performance says. That's absolutely wrong. And like, it's no way to run a company, and that we should actually be like working with the lowest 10% to really understand where they're coming from and blah, blah, blah. Right. If now one person attains power in that context and we're not actually discussing and working through that together, it results in a very bad situation. Because if he goes through with the mass firings, which he did, I was like, what the fuck? Like, we've talked about that in the past. Like, I'm now holding on to this anger that he did something which he knows goes against me. At the same time, he thinks I should have developed a method of getting rid of the lowest performers, and that I wouldn't do it because I'm too empathetic or too nice. So now we've just got this distance where we don't see eye to eye. We're not talking about it. We're both kind of taking actions in our own way with the power that we have. And so we're now just sitting out here in this space, which is quite bad, and we're both utilizing this power kind of against each other, but not like, it's not literal. Like, I'm not going against his directive. He's not going against my directive, but he's using the channels of powers that he has, and I'm using this channel. And that's what you see in kind of like these companies that become non-functional, right? It's like bureaucracy almost. It's like people hold power in all these different places. They don't communicate. And then the whole company is just fucked because everyone's holding on to their own power. Luckily, we didn't have quite that much, bureaucracy, but we did have opposition in cases,
This sort of dissonance in what each of you believed and therefore applied in the company. It felt like there maybe wasn't an agreed upon system that you were like, that you both looked at the system and went, it can improve in this way, it should improve in that way, and then you work on the system as opposed to just like you apply your own system.
Yeah. So let me give a great example of that. Like with the leaders circle, I just did that. I don't know. Adam walked by it lots of times. I think he even poked his head in the door like, what are you guys doing in here? I've explained it to him. I don't know if he ever believed in it or he thought it was bullshit or whatever. But it was my thing. And so whatever, I'm a co-founder. I can do what I want. At the same time, he would conduct meetings in ways that I didn't think were productive, just the way they were held and the interactions and stuff. I would sit there being like, I would never run a meeting like this, And so, yeah, those are two high level, leadership polls or something that our team members are experiencing both of them, and they're clearly not aligned. Like, that's not good. It was, again, like, it was okay when we're all under, like you said, like maybe when we're sub 100 people, it's like people could kind of see it's all connected because they experience us more fully. But then when they're only getting like a short amount of time from here and a short amount of time from here, it's like, what the hell is going on here? This is weird. I'm sure it was very weird for many people. And there were people who would say, other people would actually identify it as, I'm Team Miguel or I'm Team Adam. Again, not good.
And you didn't have this sort of feedback mechanism that highlighted the difference in systems and approaches that forced you to come together to talk about them.
It's funny. It's weird to say that because it's like we overlapped and talked about stuff so much, but I guess we just avoided the subjects where there was where I guess we were just kind of okay with what the other person was doing, but didn't. Yeah, it's a very tough one to figure out, like how there could be that opposition, and yet we also would like be allowing it to happen, you know? Because it's also like we were also very aligned in many ways. That's what's really weird, is that I can remember as I'm cycling through this, like so many times where it's just the two of us, you know, talking about where we are, what we're going through, what we're doing, where we're going, you know, and finding so much richness and connection in that experience. So it's not like we were like two people who never talked to each other. Like we really did have these points of intense, you know, closeness and alignment. And maybe that's why we could just allow the other things to happen. You know, it's a bit like, you know, it's sort of like if you were in a marriage and I don't know, one partner was super into sports, but the other one didn't really like sports. And so they were really into, I don't know, fashion or something. And so they would go to fashion shows and the other one would go to sports. I don't know. It's hard to find how it worked, but kind of worked up until a point.
The general media has also sort of portrayed it as there being this sort of like almost like power split. It felt like over time, Adam felt a lot more in control. And I know that you, when you guys took the benchmark money, you agreed that you would give him some of your equity if he took the money once your equity was worth over $100 million. And so there was, I suppose, this natural division in the amount of equity that you both had. What was the impact that you felt in terms of the sort of dynamic within the company of leadership?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one, because when you think about where a company's power lies, you know, there's different sources. And certainly if you look at just, you know, board control, then he had the power. And if you look at, voting shares, he had the power. But I guess in my view, like when you looked at the like soul of the company, I felt like I had power and agency the whole way through. I mean, up until SoftBank came in. So yeah, I didn't feel disempowered in that way, because I honestly didn't find it very interesting, those power sources, right? Like Adam is incredibly powerful as a business person to be able to raise billions of dollars for the company. But why was he able to do that? Because in my view, I was leading a team that developed an incredible product, you know, and spiritually, like soulfully, that product was just intertwined with my DNA, you know, and so much of what was like, if I went to Moscow and I met the team there and I felt the energy that they had amongst each other, and then that they were putting towards building WeWork locations in Moscow, that felt directly connected to me, right? So yes, that was fueled by capital, which Adam raised and which I didn't play a direct role in, but like I never felt disconnected from what was happening in the company in any way, you know? And in fact, I felt empowered to be like, these are people who I'm deeply connected to, and yet I just met them and they're in Moscow or Jakarta or Sydney, or name a city around the world. Like imagine how fulfilling that is, to feel this immediacy of energetic connection, you know, and also having them feel empowered by me being there and by me, sharing this vision of the future with them. So yeah, there's a whole arena of things which like I didn't have power over, but at the same time, I'm like, what did that actually do? I mean, I know it did a lot, and that sounds sort of idiotic to be like these billions of dollars, but at the same time, like that has a limit, right? Like if you have billions of dollars without a culture of thousands of people to deploy that, it doesn't mean anything. And I won't take exclusive responsibility. I would say for this product DNA, I would say I have direct connection. Adam's DNA is also fully in the company in so many ways. But it's a bit more what the member and the employee on the ground would experience would be direct to me. Whereas you could say there's a whole culture of what it takes to power a startup, the drive, the kind of like relentlessness, the kind of, belief that you can do irrationally hard things. A lot of that stuff would come from him. So again, it's a combination, but that power is kind of like, I don't care. Like, what difference does it make? It doesn't affect me in a day-to-day basis in any way whatsoever. As long as we've got the fuel coming in, like, I'm good.
I love the term, the soul of the company. I think that's a really powerful clarification on like the different elements that are needed. The thing that then feels like it must have been very tricky is when it felt much later on, Rebekah came in and took a much more present role. She's then like named as a third co-founder, despite obviously only being like a support to Adam at the start. I don't know for how many years until she's actually properly involved in the company. And she took on roles like chief branding officer. And again, I look at how much you love design and brand, and you grew up like in the same town that Nike was born. You look at like the power of brand and how that was a massive impact on you. Her whole thing was like spirituality, and they had like taken a lot from the Kabbalah Center, and like there was a lot that was kind of like her narrative. It felt. What was the impact on you?
Well, first I would say that there are a lot of, I guess I would call it perspectives or bits of wisdom or, ways of seeing things that Rebekah added, which are super helpful. And, she was a part of a lot of the discussions that we had about the meaning of the brand, going like, what is this we thing all about, and how do we express it, and how do we make it something that is deeper than, then there's sort of like a we, which comes from that thing we're talking about before of community. We're all holding hands. We're kind of here. And then there's a we, which is sort of like, whoa, on a much broader, deeper human level, we're all connected, and Kabbalah, I think, has that in it where, we're all one in a sense. And I think that perspective for me personally was really helpful, and it helped broaden, my understanding of a lot of things. So in that way, it was great. I think this is a lot of the difficulty is like the messenger really matters, and I think I'm not taking tons of great credit, but I think I have the gift of being a good messenger in that context, so I could talk about a subject and it would most likely be received well. I think the same subject, if Rebekah spoke about it, many people would find it off-putting or abrasive. Some people would love it too, but I think there's a lot of people who would just find the way she presented things and talked about things to not be for them, So that's a bit problematic when you're kind of like, she's all of a sudden inserted into a situation at, on stage or at a very high level with like a sense of, again, like power, where it's sort of like this is being forced upon you, which for me, I have some way of people seeing me as I'm amongst them. I might be sharing wisdom, but I'm not speaking from a higher place, which I don't feel like I am speaking from a higher place. I just feel like I'm in this just like everyone else is. And if I'm speaking, it's just to share something I might have learned. So I think she's set up for failure in that context in one way. And then two, she just has certain personality and what would you call it? Just like ways of saying things that really rub people the wrong way. So that's tough. It's tough because she could be right or wrong about things and it wouldn't matter. Sort of like the way she would express it would oftentimes really bother people. And so, that was hard. And it was hard for a lot of people to accept, especially people who worked at WeWork for a really long time and who worked, like I talked about before, tons of hours, put their heart into this, like really believed in it, to then have someone who's been a bit tangential come in and kind of like speak from the mountaintop to them. Not good. So yeah, it was complex. For me personally, I could give a shit about the roles, the titles, any of that stuff. Cause it's the same thing I was saying before, is like, where was true power derived for me? It had nothing to do with a title or a role or a job description or anything. None of that meant anything. I just did what I wanted to do. And so that stuff never bothered me. And I never saw her in any way sort of as usurping anything that I ever did in any way. I enjoyed collaborating with her on multiple things for sure. Many times I think that work that we did together was the best work that we did in the company. But that was like her and I and maybe a couple of other people doing stuff. That was good. But some of the stuff where it went outside of that room wasn't great.
So the point where this seemed to become more present was later on, close to the IPO. And one of the much more sort of public displays of Rebekah's input into WeWork was in the S1, which is the document that gets filed as a company approaches its IPO. It's the first sort of representation of the company to the financial public markets. Can you talk a bit about that process? What happened there?
I like that you said the financial public markets, because I think that's a bit of our fundamental mistake, is that it's supposed to be a financial document. And I think back to that time, our idealism in terms of being a company that was unlike any that had come before really found its place in that S1 document. And we saw it much more as a way to stake our claim on kind of capitalism and this whole way in which entrepreneurs build a company and then go into public markets. And so our ambition was quite high. And so I think that document, I mean, I actually should go back and read it because I haven't. But when you look at it as an extension of who we were at the time, I feel like it was very true to our whole, flow and our idealism, our belief that like what we were doing had been validated in so many ways. I mean, if you look back to that time, we had people saying, oh, you're a $60 billion company or whatever, $100 billion company. You'll have the biggest IPO from a New York grown company in history, blah, 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 right? So every signal is saying like, you're the greatest. And that's the energy that we had going into building that S1. And so now it's hard to like look back and feel like we did something wrong in staying kind of true to that spirit. But I would also say that it was a fundamental mistake. And I think that from what I recall, you know, Rebekah had some pretty hard lines in terms of what she felt like it had to live up to in how it was expressing who we are. And, you know, didn't want to compromise when it came to other people's opinions about whether or not this was a smart direction, you know? And I think that was a bit of where Rebekah had this blessing and curse, you know, like in one way she could have this really great aspiration to do good in the world and to think about things holistically, and then also in this other way have this inability to like be grounded, you know, and just be like, look, we're here now. We've got to just do what we got to do to. And so that process, I just took so long, and there was so many rewrites and so many hours and so many opinions, and just, you know, and I don't even know. I just left the process because it moved literally out of the building and to the Hamptons. And then I was just like, I can't take it anymore. Like, this is just, you know, I'm not going out to the Hamptons to keep working on the S1. So then I didn't even know what happened with it. Just beyond that, like, I kind of was like, well, I'm out. And it's one of those examples where I believe in the inspiration. Like, I believe in the direction. I believe in where we were going with it. And I think there's a whole bunch of things that happened previous to our IPO where it's hard not to have curiosity for, if those things didn't happen, what kind of company would we have become had that S1 been well received and the company went public, because it was so ambitious and it was so different than what had been done before. So there's loss in that for sure. There's huge loss for me, because we didn't get the opportunity to follow that journey. Not that there would have been completion, but it just would have been through to the next big, you know, kind of milestone. Yeah.
It felt like the parts of the S1 that the public had the most visceral reaction to were the things which, I suppose, when you're in this sort of like reality distorted sense, when you just get given an obscene amount of VC money and you start spending it in a somewhat an obscene way. And then it also felt that like Adam became more interested in maximizing his wealth, things like selling the trademark for We back to the company, the private jet, those things. This is what felt like the public didn't like or didn't enjoy. And then I suppose the packaging of it, which had the Rebekah's touch and the wording and the images and all that stuff, that felt like the sort of icing on the cake, but it didn't feel like the bit that the financial markets were most like viscerally reactive to.
There's so many layers, right? Because the highlights or the lowlights, whatever you want to call them, those things which especially Adam was vilified for, are a joke. And I say that literally. Like, the whole selling the trademark back to the company is something that was so minuscule and minimal in the big scheme of things that it first had nothing to do with him. It had to do with the fact that when we started the company, we owned the trademarks for all We brands, and we only gave the company WeWork. And then we still held these other We brands. And in order to move them into this new company that was going to go public, they had to be contributed. But they theoretically had a lot of value, because IP has value. So you can't, without consequences, just transfer something of value. Like, you need to be paid for it. And at the time, while it sounds like a crazy amount of money to any normal person, those millions of dollars were like, pennies relative to this $100 billion company. So no one thought twice about it. It wasn't a thing that anyone was like, oh, it was this little movement of pennies. And it's really hard to be like, a company was brought down in some ways by something so minimal and like transactional and irrelevant. And it was basically just a little micro box check that had to be completed before the company could move forward. Similarly, like he's been vilified for this thing of him owning buildings and like leasing them to WeWork. Like we had how many buildings? Hundreds of buildings, hundreds of real estate deals, tons of different deal terms, a couple buildings that he happened to own and lease back, so minimal. And in his overall, like it made no meaning to him in his overall personal wealth at the time, right? But again, it's easy when you look at it in just absolute terms of those values and you think, hey, if I'm a normal person, if I own a building and I lease it to WeWork, like that's meaningful to me in that context, right? But in the context we were in, that had no meaning. And it was also a fair deal, right? Like it wasn't like he was getting some incredible sweetheart deal. And it was also disclosed in every single way, like in all the ways it's supposed to be disclosed, whatever those things are called legally, like every disclosure was made, every box was checked, all of that. So like these were kind of ridiculous points. And it's frustrating that those were, that he personally was somehow blamed for those things. Now, at the same time, the reason for that was because he showed other signs of being entitled and perhaps power hungry, et cetera. So if his personal brand and wasn't in that place, those things probably wouldn't have struck a chord with people. But I agree, the like private jets and the like expensive tequila and stuff, probably when you put it all together, it like didn't look good, right? So all of that on some level is really disappointing because if that was the difference in why the company was able to go public, that would, be really heartbreaking in a sense, because those were not meaningful points. Now, the real reason why the company wasn't able to go public also had nothing to do with the stuff that maybe Rebekah put in the S1. It just had to do with the underlying financials of the business, which when people looked at, they were like, hey, this doesn't look so great. That would be a great headline if it was just that, and that's why we didn't go public. It's like, okay, fine. We could accept that. And you can correct those things, figure them out. That would all have been fine. Like we could have survived that in that moment. You know what I mean? So it's lame to me that it was like petty things that ended up being the kind of high points in that whole story. And it's petty to, like, we love as an American culture specifically to take people down. So that's a bummer too, that was what happened in this case. And I don't think anyone has sympathy, or very few people have sympathy for Adam and Rebekah. But it's unfortunate that those were the component parts of something that, to me, had a potential for great value. And the context I'll put that in is we had a time, I don't think it exists now in the same way, where companies that had a social mission were being celebrated. Like companies that do good in the world, and also are financially successful, are thought to be the greatest companies in the world. So like Patagonia would be one that celebrated a ton. And I was really frustrated by Patagonia as an example, by the fact that they didn't go public. They didn't take on this challenge of what does it mean to both be a profit-oriented, company trying to do well by its shareholders, but also by public shareholders, because that's a different level than obviously private ones, and also deal with all of the regulation and everything that comes with that, to try to strike this balance between doing good and also, doing well financially. And I think Patagonia, at the time that they decided to go the other route with this whatever private trust, they dodged that whole thing. And they could have been, because everyone loves Patagonia, one of the first companies that says, we're going to do it a completely different way. And I thought we could have been that kind of company. And so as an experiment, it's just sad for me to see that experiment was taken down by things that, again, in the big scheme of things, seem quite petty. Now, if it's financial fundamentals, fine. But the financial fundamentals, those changed based on, in my view, and I haven't read all the books like you have, but the way I experienced it was, WeWork is great. All the private, whatever, big unicorns are losing tons of money. No one cares. They're all going to get capital and figure it out in the future. Uber goes public, does terrible. Lyft goes public, does terrible. Now the market says we don't like companies that are not profitable and are losing tons of money. And now WeWork needs to go public and we're f***ed. That's the basic narrative as I see it. And it speaks nothing to the actual WeWork business. It just speaks to the way that the financial world was evaluating companies and believing what their trajectory was supposed to be. And we had terrible timing, we got, and then when you combine that with these things that people could layer on, that Adam is some terrible guy and Rebekah's some terrible person and blah, 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 it's a bummer. And it's a bummer not for us. I could give a fuck about us. I'm saying it's a bummer for the way that we would have challenged what it means to be a public company. And I think that needed to be challenged. Now, today is a whole different world, so I don't even know what's going to happen. But I do think at that time, we were on a trajectory where the Larry Finks of the world were saying these kind of companies are the future,
Yeah, it was definitely a wave of growth at all costs. And I feel like WeWork was the perfect representation of that. And you played by the book of that narrative at the time in the startup world and the private world. And I mean, Massa was the epitome of that and would therefore funded WeWork to do exactly that. And so it made sense that you played by that book. I suppose the difficulty is the perception of profitability versus the reality. How close were you with the financial department and this whole community adjusted EBITDA and all of these things kind of tried to make it seem like it was more profitable than it was?
Not close enough. But I don't know if that was my job, but definitely not close enough. I mean, I think, to be honest, I think where we were after the failed IPO was a surprise, because, I mean, I'm not pointing fingers, but I don't think our CFO was, at least it wasn't his job to publicly say what's going on with the company, obviously. So if there were fucked up things, he wasn't standing in front of the all company meeting. But, and so he and Adam and others may have had a clearer picture of that. But it was definitely shocking to me, at the narrative, at least, that was things are going up and to the right, and yes, fueled by lots of capital, but not to the point that we're at a breaking point where we're about to go bankrupt, And some things I've learned after that, not confirmed, only just from different discussions, is that may have not been true as well, based on different evaluations. But
That what wasn't true, sorry.
That we were about to be bankrupt. Because that was kind of the narrative, right? Was that like we failed in the IPO and now we're basically f***ed because we don't have a capital source and we're running out of money. And it was like an overnight devaluation from 100 billion to zero. You know, that this is the kind of value destruction that was told by some people to the world, and also, you know, blamed on Adam, for example. And that even in itself, I mean, this is part of the thing. We make big heroes of entrepreneurs who achieve a lot, and then if they fail, it's also all their fault, right? Is it possible to imagine that Adam was exclusively responsible for that? It's hard to believe, you know, that we didn't have a CFO and a COO, and, you know, so I and other really seasoned professionals who are working for us. And so I personally was in many executive meetings where I never heard someone raising a red flag being like, hey, we better do X or Y or else we're going to crash, you know? So I'm a bit confused about the exact mechanics of that. But that's to my own responsibility of not working harder to understand that and being a bit like, I'm doing my own thing over here. You guys got that part handled, I'm sure. You know, so I take that as a co-founder. I certainly take that as a failure on my part, to not have like a more clear understanding of that. But I mean, I'm not a finance person, and it would have taken a ton of work for me to even comprehend the complexity. And even like our debt, for example, which debt played a huge role in the ongoing, you know, obviously up until the bankruptcy, you know, a huge role in everything, and the continuous debt that was incurred. Even that, I don't understand debt well enough to like, I've heard many times, oh, this company's carrying X billion in debt. And I'm like, and their stock is at what? Like, how does this work? I don't exactly know how all these financial systems work at that level and scale. So not an area where I would have been able to help too much. Yeah. I would say where I did know things and didn't do enough is that I think we were off mission in a lot of areas in terms of where we were spending money on projects, and that I did try in different times to, you know, rein that in or at least question, like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? I should have, and that's to the expense of probably hundreds of millions of dollars. So I certainly take responsibility for not trying harder, in that way to like pull us back into a more focused approach. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard. It's no one except for the very few who have been given billions of dollars of investment can say what they would do, because they don't know what it feels like, and they don't know what that pressure to, like what I said before, you take Adam and I, we're both all in all the time, go all out all the time. Apply that to a company that's built with that mentality, and then give it billions of dollars. It's like, it's hard to be like, okay, let's stay very focused and financially responsible and stay within our lane and make sure every transaction is, you know, a good one. And yeah, it wasn't in our DNA.
And there's an element of you and the leadership team, given all of the responsibilities and the pressure that you have as the company grows, you need to trust each other to be on top of each other's job. And specifically like the finances that you're not an expert in, you don't understand to the degree which should be necessary to understand the situation, you have to trust the CFO and Adam to be on top of it, right? Now looking back at it, how would you balance having an awareness of all the different parts of the business as the company and your responsibilities grow?
That is a great question. And I think it ties into some of the questions that I think any entrepreneur has in terms of sort of journey versus outcomes. Because I personally don't find money interesting. I mean, it's really weird. I don't have the exact words around it, but like, it's not that I don't find it interesting. It's that I don't feel, how do I say? I'm not fascinated by it, Like I understand in the simple sense why and where money matters in a company for sure. But the methods by which you manage it, move it, utilize it in complex ways is not interesting to me. So when you're talking about finance as a function of a business, that's where I just kind of go, I don't know. All that engineering of how to use money in different ways, I don't find it compelling at all. My curiosity sort of doesn't lead me there. So it's tough because as a person who has been a part of a company that failed because of that, doing that poorly, it succeeded by doing it well, and then it failed by doing it poorly, right? So it's complex to figure that out. But yeah, I don't know. That's a great question, because I definitely would much rather be like, I trust that person, they're doing it, and I'm good. But yeah, it is a great question. I think that what the advice I've been given by a lot of smart people is, keep an eye on it, So if I get to that place where I'm building something that's, bigger, then I would say I would like to develop a method to keep an eye on it that works for me.
Because that method, I feel, has to evolve over the evolution of the company. At the start, you're just being scrappy and you're being resourceful, and in the first WeWork location, you don't want to pay the electrician, so you figure out how to wire the place yourself, which I'm like, that is wicked example of founder scrappiness at the start. And it's like you have that resourceful mindset, and then obviously as you get pumped for the money, that kind of changes, and you have this permission to kind of put that scrappiness to the side.
That's where I think there's complexity, right? Because in the channels where our culture carried forward, I think we maintained that same scrappiness. Now, not exactly, because there were changes in method. So if you look at just the electrical systems, right, we couldn't be scrappy in a traditional sense with electrical because we were not on the ground in the building, but we could approach electrical systems at a higher level in terms of how we designed and planned them to be more efficient than what you might get in your typical construction project, right? So our scrappiness, where we were able to carry it forward, definitely was still there. And in operations, our team was certainly mindful of every dollar, of expenditure. And so I think that really carried forward. I think where it went outside of our ability to carry that forward is in more, again, in that kind of like large finance area, because how can you be scrappy when you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, I don't know. It's a very on the ground approach. I don't know what it means. I guess there's conservativeness maybe would be a way to think of scrappiness, but it would be like, okay, we need to get a return on every dollar that we're putting out, for example. And so we're going to be very careful about how that works. And now we apply that to tens of millions of dollars in the same way. Yeah, that's where I would say there's a difference, right? Because if you're thinking immediate and short term, you can see the results in a loop. When you look kind of bigger and long term, those results are not as immediate. You look at them a bit more as like an investment, and it's harder to be scrappy in investments, right? Investments are more like bets. Bets are not scrappy, you know? So I think it changes in that way. Like when you get big, you're more like, okay, we've got these big chunks of millions. Let's make a bet over there and a bet over there and a bet over there. I don't know. It's a weird one.
It comes back to the more like absolute power that Adam had when it came to the investment decisions. Like it felt like there were lots of things which felt aligned with his personal philosophy on what to invest in, but it wasn't as maybe systemized as it should have been with that scale.
Yeah. So one of the other things which got a lot of criticism was the surfing company that we invested in, right? That makes artificial waves. So that's a good example of like, what the hell? That makes no sense. And that was a personal interest of Adam's. He likes surfing. That one was a bit for me. I'm a little bit like, what is that all about? Doesn't make much sense. Doesn't show financial discipline. Doesn't show scrappiness, really. But from a vision perspective, there was a vision which went along with it, which is that there are these We Live developments that are built around lagoons that have these, waves, and that there's this beautiful community of people who are living in these places. And that's actually aligned completely with the way we were seeing the long-term development of We Live, right? So that's again where I would say that's a bet. It's not a disciplined strategy, but if you look in the really long term, it maybe could make sense. And it's funny, if you look at what Adam is doing now, building flow in these residential communities. I don't know if he's built one with a surfing lagoon, but I'm sure it's in the wheelhouse of what he's still trying to build, right? So he believed in it it wasn't just a one-off, oh yeah, let me just invest in this random surfing company. Like it was actually part of his true, vision. So yeah, these are interesting ones. Now, there are probably some other examples that aren't that clear.
It feels like it's sort of jumping a couple of steps in the vision before you've nailed the next step.
Yeah, so that's a good way to put it.
Like nail We Live and then buy the surf company to then like a company We Live.
Right.
But I understand, like, again, it feels like there's this like reality distortion. Like when you have all the money in the world, you get to do anything you want in the world. And I suppose then you get to like prioritize these things because everything seems relatively assured because you just keep getting given more and more money. How else did this sort of like reality distortion show up that you didn't realize when you were in it, but looking back on it, you were like, oh yeah, that was really warped?
I mean, I don't want to pick on anything in particular because I do think there were good people involved in everything. I think we had a cities team, for example, which I think I spoke about on the Rich Roll podcast because it was quite fun to envision, cities and how they work. But I would say that was premature, similarly to, where we were with We Live as an example. Like we had like one, maybe two We Live buildings. We were far from really being able to participate at a city level. There were movements happening towards, large real estate developments. So it certainly wasn't out of the question, but it was probably premature to have the investment into that team that was quite expensive team. I think that's another part. This is a really interesting one when it comes to that scrappy mentality. Is talent is a very complex thing in the context of scrappiness, because when you're resource constrained, you kind of look at what you can get. Here's the people we can hire. Like, we can afford them, their experience level, or their desire to work for a startup at a lower salary with some equity compensation. Those constraints, they put this container, this barrier around who you can hire at all, who makes sense in the context. When you're not resource constrained, talent becomes this very interesting thing of like, we want to build the best team in the world, right? So let's go get that person who's like high level at Google, or this other person who's high level at, Facebook, or this research scientist, who's got a background from MIT and whatever. And like, those people are quite expensive. It's not scrappy to hire someone from one of these places at that level, but it really shifts your mentality when you open yourself up to this approach, which says, the way I heard it at Google was something like, I don't know, for every top engineer at Google, there's like 1,000 other people who are kind of like basically supporting them, like that's how different, and there's a quote about, I don't know, you would probably know it or you'll look it up after, about the like top engineers are 100x above average or whatever. It's not like a step.
It's not linear, it's
Yeah.
exponential, the quality of
Yeah,
talent.
exactly.
Yeah.
That premise, when you learn that, and then you're like, well, we have millions or billions, it kind of puts you into this whole other way of looking at the world. And it's quite disorienting, because you can no longer look the way you used to about what it means, what value creation means, and what ROI is in like a team member and stuff, because it's also much more, when you look at cities, it's way more long-term. It's like, well, the people we're hiring now, we're not building a city tomorrow, right? But we need really smart, really big thinkers to imagine what would the city of the future look like if we were building it through our ideals and all we've learned. So you can't look at these very expensive people and put them in the same context as the architect, interior designer, construction manager, real estate person, community manager, who are working over here, who are probably in most cases getting paid 1/8, 1/10, at best 1/2 of what these people over here who aren't producing anything are getting paid. So in the same company, holy fuck, that gets so complex, of like a bunch of smart people over here who are super talented, who are producing nothing, nothing in an immediate tangible sense. And then a bunch of people here are kicking ass on the ground every day, building WeWork to become this, 1,000 location, which is really hard work. Like, building WeWork locations is so hard, like so complex, so much focus, so much coordination, so much collaboration. And culturally, that's just crazy hard to maintain both of those mindsets of like scrappiness over here and whatever you call this other thing over here. I think in our case, when we're talking more about the criticism of the company, it was a lack of focus to have all of these people doing all these things that weren't aligned with the core business, And I think that's where, if you look at WeWork as it exists today, again, I don't know its current profitability or not, but it's, at least from what it looks like, it's a sustainable business as just the work business, in the right locations with decent real estate deals. So all that other stuff that we were doing was kind of unnecessary to what WeWork was at its core. Now, was WeWork ever fairly valued? for just WeWork, no, right? Like the valuations that were achieved and applied to the investment rounds included this vision of all of these other things, right? So it's very hard to separate that and look back at like, okay, where did we go wrong in promoting the idea that we would do so much more than WeWork, because we kind of needed it to fuel the narrative of who we are in the world. But it's just interesting if you look at like Airbnb, like what is Airbnb other than a booking engine for, I don't know, whatever you call it, non-traditional hospitality, right? That's basically all it is. There have been other times where it seems like they tried to add more to that, and they kind of had experiences, they did some owned properties here and there, stuff like that. But if you look at it, at least to me, they're pretty down the line, straightforward, good guardrails, booking engine for properties. At a time, you would have looked at WeWork and been like, WeWork is or the We company was all over the place. We Live, schools, surfing companies, cities, like a giant real estate fund. Who knows? There's so many different parts. A giant tech team, like hundreds of employees building a tech platform that may or may not, probably wasn't ever even valuable or needed, but that whole game was one that we played from the beginning. Even from the benchmark, meeting that we had where we raised the first like venture capital, we presented the idea that this tech platform would support WeWork members outside of buildings, that there would be the ones in buildings and there'd be ones out who still got some benefit. So it was there from the whole start that we believed that there was this like extension. But the games that I play in my mind are like, what would have happened if we just stayed completely focused on WeWork and we were totally amazing at it, and we just kept building WeWork locations and we didn't worry about all that other stuff, and we would have had, I don't know, who knows, a $3 billion IPO or something, $5 billion IPO, like could have been amazing, could have been a great company, could have been, and who knows, now maybe it grows. COVID threw a monkey wrench in everything, which it's hard to ignore that aspect. But if you just look at what it could have been, still maybe could have been a great company.
Obviously a super intense experience, this whole roller coaster over 10 years. And you spoke publicly about how you did a lot of therapy and like reflection afterwards. You obviously moved from the US to the UK, and then COVID hit, and then it feels like that was a lot of reflection that you did as a result of all of this. What was the biggest learning that came from all of that reflection?
Well, first I would say before even the reflection, there was a how. So how do I exist? And I had a coach, this guy, Ted, who was actually a WeWork employee early on. And then I think he was fired by Adam, actually. But I reconnected with him, and he had become a coach. And I had worked with a few different people who were more therapists. And talk therapy was okay, but it wasn't like getting me anywhere. I was just venting a lot of stuff. And then I connected with Ted, and Ted was much more of a coach, which means more like proactive, trying to bring some more structure to processing. And so we used to always say, start with how, because the how is kind of the first way of entering this space. And we did a really simple exercise, which was intuitive structured in the sense that it had, like, we didn't follow a certain criteria, but because we were documenting everything, it kind of allowed us to slowly build up an understanding. So he was taking notes and we were recording. And so we had, it wasn't sort of just letting everything out into the ether. It was more like, all these things that are coming up, we're going to try to put them together into something and see, are there conclusions, or are there. So I think that how, had it had a ton of different approaches. I mean, one of the most simple ones that he taught me, which I guess is super obvious, but is self-awareness, is the idea that we can be both the person doing the action and a person observing ourselves doing the action. And that for me, which sounds maybe basic, I really didn't have that as a practice. I didn't have the ability to like step outside of myself and like look at myself, like, what am I up to? So I'll give an example for that. Like, I had this weird thing post WeWork where I think I was really hungry for the kind of fulfillment I would get by just from interpersonal interaction, where a lot of people valued me and wanted to interact with me, right? So what I would do is like go on LinkedIn. There's always be tons of people reaching out to me. I would respond to people. Oh, I'm so happy that you sent me a message. I would love to learn more about whatever you're doing. Like, let's schedule a time to, have a call or whatever. And I would do that for like a few people and I would feel, oh, I'm cool, I'm important, And then afterward, I would be like, fuck, what did I just do? Like, I don't want to meet all these people. Like, I don't have time for all these meetings, And then I would just be like in a spiral of like annoyance and just frustration with myself. And so part of what he helped me find was just awareness of, why am I doing this? Because I need that feeling of validation when people ask that of me, but I'm basically creating these, what I called energy leaks, where they're like unfulfilled loops, So I'm constantly creating these energy leaks where I feel guilt and like, I feel like an asshole because I've now told these people I would meet with them, but now I'm not, replying to them. And so just that awareness helped me find a new, healthier relationship with those, interactions. And then allowed me to just let go of LinkedIn altogether. So I started with a process where my interaction was different. I just engaged with them in a different way. And then by doing that, I slowly lacked the need to get the feeling that these people care about me. And I became able to not open LinkedIn ever, unless I had another reason to go there. But and that ability to go through that process helped me, get off of Instagram, helped me with a lot of different relationships that I've had where I've felt like they're energy leaks rather than things that are like actually, fueling me.
Quick pause to say, if you found this valuable, then think about who you know who might also find it valuable, because leaders helping other leaders makes the journey that much easier.
So then if you had a piece of advice for your younger self dreaming of doing something big?
The only thing really I would say is to enjoy it more along the way. I think part of what I don't do and didn't do well is, celebrate much. So, there are a lot of moments where we did cool things, and when the time to celebrate came, I kind of left the room. When I mean celebrate, I mean that more in a like emotional sense, not celebrate like, yeah, raw, good job. I mean it more in like a really letting that soak in and sink in and be like, yes, this is what it feels like to like do something that because I think in startups, and there's always the next thing. And I think we get in startups like the fastest cycle through, like, I did it, move to the next thing, It's not natural to like be like, oh wow, okay, let me take a break and actually let that sink in. the best parallel I found is like professional athletes, you know, an NBA player, and I like basketball, so I've had exposure to that, you know, dreams their whole life of becoming an NBA player. Then they make it, let's say they make it big, they make, you know, $100 million, $200 million. Now they make hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever. Then at some point their career ends. It's going to happen no matter what. Probably they've never thought about what comes after that. Now there's a little bit more of that because there are more examples, and, you know, more of them become investors and they start investing earlier on and things like that. But emotionally, psychologically, there's very little, there's no replacement for that arc, you know, once you're through it. And having that drive that got you there is hard to apply in the other world after that. So let's say you're 35 years old and you got, you know, 50 years to live, or 55, or who knows, maybe longer. What are you going to do for all that time? So I think entrepreneurship, and especially the journey, is often falls under that same kind of, you know, way of seeing things, that like, I'm working towards an outcome. I want to build a big company. Exit is often the answer. I mean, yes, some companies go public and the startup CEO stays, but those are very rare. So there's an exit point somewhere. Now, have you looked at what entrepreneurs do after that? And do you have any kind of vision of whether that's a life you want? You know, let's say, for example, that being a podcaster is what you really love the most. And I don't know if you do or not, but let's say you love being a podcaster. Well, being a podcaster with 10 million or 20 million or $50 million in the bank, probably better, because you're not worried about a bunch of stuff that comes with not having money. But what would be sad is if you love being a podcaster and you love this one-on-one interaction, and this is what really fills you up, but somehow, because you get to the other side of doing the startup and making that, you know, $50 million, that now you don't do that anymore because you think, well, I should be an investor and I should like go back and invest in startups. Well, that's fine if you like investing in startups, but what if you don't? Like, are you going to be true to yourself in that moment, or are you going to take on all these other things that come with being a successful entrepreneur and, like, you know, engage with all those things with all your time, rather than spending time with your kids and doing podcasts, you know, for example? So to me, I don't know exactly what process I would tell you to go through or I would go through, but like, there's a bit of a long, painful path of discovery that I wouldn't necessarily wish on someone. So if there was a way to kind of understand that before, then maybe there'd be things you do along the way that might be different, right? So it's a really interesting one. And it's tough because very few companies even succeed in the first place, let alone have exits that help someone become sort of independent and wealthy. So it's like really hard to be like, well, let's do this other stuff that could distract from that singular drive, you know, to achieve this. But I'll tell you, like 10 years of WeWork and 5 years of fumbling around trying to figure shit out. I don't know. I mean, no one's gonna, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm fine, but like, it's tough. Like, it's super hard to go from, you know, it's like retiring as an NBA player. Like, what do you fucking do? Like, you have all this capability and energy and like, you're at the peak, like you're so amazing. And then like, the world doesn't need you in the same way. So yeah, I mean, that's where I go back to, I've considered being a busboy at a restaurant, and I believe I have the personality where I can allow my pride or whatever else might come wouldn't stop me from doing that. It wasn't the choice that I've made yet, but there's nothing in me says, oh, you can't do that because you're some successful person. That doesn't come up for me. If that does come up for you, that's one thing I would say, like, any person, I would say, well, really examine that. Like, examine what's really showing up for you. Is it your parents and their expectations? Is it a dream that you have? Is it some construct of life, that you've built based on some point in time where you pictured what it would be like to be a wealthy person? Where's this formulation really rooted? And then work on it a bit. Like, really try to understand, like, is this really true to you? Because again, coming into that situation of having 1 million, 10 million, $100 million, it's not simple. Like, and it's a really hard time to, like, figure out who you are and what your values are. Because all of a sudden it's just context has changed so much. And so to do that discovery process, then is very hard. So yeah, I don't know. Self-awareness comes back again as the key, right? And maybe that's, if you're really good at it and you have it all the way through, maybe you're fine the whole way through because you ride, all these different cycles. And if you've got a really good process, maybe it's all no problem. I thought I did. I thought I was self-aware, but when a really tough time hit me, a super complex time, like a time where I both was going through chaos and turmoil and pain and disconnection and sadness and frustration. And then I also, was like free and retired and had enough money to, like, live without working. Like, those are crazy hard, contrasts. So I wasn't prepared for that. Now that might be quite extreme, but, like, if I would have started that with a very good process of knowing myself and going through it, I wouldn't have needed so much help. Like, I had probably 5 people at one time helping me through that. So I would recommend a very healthy self-awareness process for any entrepreneur, and who has time for that, but it's worth the investment.
Wow. What an amazing message. I couldn't agree more. And I think this balance between dedicating time to what we think we should be doing, without judging or assessing that narrative, and taking time away from that to challenge the narrative, I think is something none of us do. This has been an amazing journey. I really appreciate you taking the time. The closing tradition on this is that because you've been so generous with your time, and you will undoubtedly help a ton of people with this sharing of your experiences and wisdom, is there something that an audience of entrepreneurs and ambitious, self-aware people could support you with?
That's a great question. I think the thing which I appreciate the most is being able to interact with people in a way that feels open and honest and sorry, it sounds quite weird, but the most uncomfortable thing for me is being put on a pedestal. And there are some interactions where the moment I interact with someone, it feels that way. And then, so if I'm asking for anything from anyone, which feels quite weird, it's like to somehow let go of that I think everyone wants that. I think every person who's achieved a lot or is successful or famous or whatever, if they get to have a eye-to-eye real interaction, it feels amazing. And it's a gift that you can give to someone to show up that way, no matter who you are, whether it's your first day as an entrepreneur or you're still in school or who knows what. If you look at the person as they're a person, they're just like you, there's no hierarchy, there's no pedestal, there's nothing. It's just equal human beings. That's an amazing gift.
Beautiful message to finish. Thank you so much. This has been exceptional. Really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.